In the early winter of 1984, the city of Bhopal, situated in the heart of India, was a place of quiet transitions. It was a city where the ancient stone architecture of the Nawabi era sat uncomfortably alongside the steel and concrete of a rapidly industrializing nation. On the night of December 2nd, the air was particularly still. A thin mist hung over the crowded neighborhoods of the old city, where thousands of families had settled in makeshift homes, many of them drawn to the area by the promise of work at the massive industrial complex that loomed on the northern horizon. That complex, a sprawling 60-acre facility owned by Union Carbide India Limited, was once seen as a symbol of progress, a key player in India's green revolution. It produced Sevin, a powerful pesticide designed to protect the country's crops. But by December 1984, the factory was no longer a symbol of hope. Production had slumped. The facility was losing money, and its pristine white towers were beginning to show the rust of neglect. As the city slept, most of its inhabitants were unaware that the ground beneath them was already vibrating with a silent, catastrophic failure. In the control room of the pesticide plant, a series of gauges began to flicker, indicating a rise in pressure that defied the plant's operational logic. What began as a routine shift would, within hours, become the site of the deadliest industrial accident in human history. Yet, even decades later, the exact sequence of events that led to the rupture remains a matter of intense technical dispute. Records suggest a series of human errors, but some investigators believe the true catalyst has never been fully acknowledged. To understand the scale of what was about to happen, one must understand the substance involved, methyl isocyanate, or MIC. It is a chemical so volatile that it must be kept at temperatures near freezing. It is highly reactive, and when it comes into contact with water, it triggers an exothermic reaction, a violent release of heat and gas. On that night, Tank 610, an underground storage vessel containing 42 tons of MIC, began to heat up. The first signs that something was wrong appeared around 11:30 p.m. Workers on the night shift noticed their eyes beginning to sting. There was a faint smell, described by some as boiled cabbage, lingering near the MIC structure. In any other facility, this would have triggered an immediate high-level investigation. But here, minor leaks had become so common that the staff reportedly treated them as a nuisance rather than a threat. They decided to address the issue after their tea break. But that wasn't the strangest part of the initial response. As the workers sat for tea, the pressure inside Tank 610 wasn't just rising, it was accelerating at a rate that the plant's safety systems were never designed to handle. By the time the operators returned to the control room, the pressure gauge for Tank 610 had topped out. It was no longer reading a number. The needle was pinned to the far right of the dial. The concrete slab covering the tank began to crack and heave. In a panic, the staff attempted to activate the safety systems. They turned on the vent gas scrubber, a device intended to neutralize escaping gas by spraying it with caustic soda. It didn't work. They tried to ignite the flare tower, which was supposed to burn off any escaping vapors before they could reach the atmosphere. It was out of service, a pipe having been removed for maintenance weeks earlier. What happened next changed the narrative of industrial safety forever. At approximately 12:45 a.m. on December 3rd, the safety valve on Tank 610 burst open. A massive plume of concentrated MIC vapor shot into the cold night air, rising high above the plant, before being caught by a gentle breeze blowing toward the south, directly toward the densest population centers of Bhopal. The gas didn't dissipate. Because MIC is twice as heavy as air, it didn't float away into the atmosphere. It hugged the ground, flowing through the narrow alleys and into the low-lying shanties like a ghostly, invisible tide. In the neighborhoods of Jayaprakash Nagar and Kenchichola, People woke up coughing. It wasn't a normal cough. It felt as though their lungs were being filled with fire. Archival photographs from the following morning show a city in total disarray, but they cannot capture the sensory horror of those first few minutes. People began to run, but the more they exerted themselves, the more gas they inhaled. Many died in their sleep. Others died in the streets, blinded by the chemical's corrosive effect on their corneas, stumbling over the bodies of those who had fallen before them. At the plant, the confusion was total. The internal siren was turned on, then quickly turned off to avoid alarming the public, a decision that remains a point of bitter contention. By the time the loud, continuous siren was finally triggered, the gas cloud had already traveled miles into the city. As the sun began to rise over Bhopal, revealing a landscape littered with the carcasses of cattle and the bodies of thousands of citizens, the world began to ask how this could have happened. The official explanation from the Indian government focused on a water washing theory that water had entered the tank during a routine pipe cleaning operation. But Union Carbide's own internal investigators would eventually propose a very different, more disturbing theory. The discrepancy between these two versions of events is where the historical record begins to blur. To this day, there is no clear consensus on how the water that triggered the reaction actually got into tank 610. While the water washing theory points to a catastrophic failure of maintenance and supervision, the alternative theory suggests something much more deliberate. Union Carbide later claimed that a disgruntled employee had intentionally introduced water into the tank through a pressure gauge port as an act of sabotage. They argued that the amount of water required to cause such a massive reaction could not have entered the system by accident. Independent investigators, however, have pointed to a different set of facts. They noted that several key safety systems were either non-functional or had been turned off to save money. The refrigeration system that was supposed to keep the MIC at 0 degrees Celsius had been shut down months earlier. The vent gas scrubber was underdimensioned for a leak of this magnitude. And that's when things began to shift from a tragedy of errors into a complex legal and scientific mystery. If the plant had been operating according to its original design specifications, the leak might have been contained or at least mitigated, but records suggest that the Bhopal plant was operating under a different set of rules than its sister plant in West Virginia. As the death toll climbed into the thousands in those first 72 hours, the medical community in Bhopal faced an unprecedented crisis. They were treating a mass poisoning with a chemical they didn't fully understand. Doctors at the Hamidia Hospital were overwhelmed, seeing patients with symptoms that didn't just affect the lungs, but the nervous system, the kidneys, and the blood. A central question emerged in the wards. Was this just MIC poisoning, or were the victims also being exposed to hydrogen cyanide? The presence of cyanide would have changed the treatment protocol entirely, potentially saving thousands of lives. Yet, the chemical composition of the cloud remained a subject of fierce debate between the company's doctors and local health officials. What they found next changed the narrative entirely, as the focus shifted from the immediate mechanical failure to the deeper, systemic secrets held within the company's internal memos. The medical crisis in the days following the leak was not merely a matter of scale, but of science. As thousands of gasping survivors crowded into the hallways of Bhopal's hospitals, a terrifying medical mystery began to unfold. Doctors noticed that many of the deceased had blood that remained a bright cherry red color, a classic clinical sign of cyanide poisoning. This observation led to a fierce, clandestine debate within the medical community. Had the methyl isocyanate, under the extreme heat of the tank's reaction, partially decomposed into hydrogen cyanide? If cyanide was present, the antidote was a common chemical called sodium thiosulfate. Early trials on a small group of patients showed promising results, with survivors reporting a sudden lifting of the heavy weight on their chests. But then, the narrative took an unexpected turn. the use of the antidote was suddenly restricted. Some reports from the time suggest that if the company or the government admitted to cyanide poisoning, it would have changed the legal classification of the disaster and the perceived toxicity of the chemicals involved. For the victims, this wasn't a matter of chemistry, it was a matter of survival. Yet, the official stance remained that the gas was non-cyanide, and the distribution of the life-saving antidote became a point of bureaucratic and legal friction. This medical uncertainty was mirrored by the confusion over how the water had entered tank 610 inches the first place. To understand why this remains one of the most debated points in industrial history, one has to look at the physical layout of the plant. The water washing theory, supported by many independent investigators and trade unions, suggests that the water entered through a process known as backflow. Workers were cleaning a series of pipes nearby with high-pressure hoses. Because several valves were leaking and a critical safety device, a slip blind, had not been installed, the water supposedly traveled through a jumper line that had been added during a previous modification of the plant. However, the physics of this theory are complex. Some engineers have argued that for water to travel that distance and overcome the pressure differences, it would have required a specific, almost improbable set of conditions. This is where Union Carbide's alternative explanation gained its footing. They pointed to the fact that the pressure gauge on the tank had been removed and then replaced. They claimed that a disgruntled employee had deliberately connected a water hose directly to the tank's opening. But there is no clear consensus on the identity of this alleged saboteur, and no witness ever came forward to confirm seeing such an act. What remains clear is that the plant's design had been modified in ways that made both scenarios possible. The jumper line itself was a temporary fix that had become permanent, a common practice in a facility that was struggling to stay profitable. As the technical investigation stalled, the political and legal storm arrived in the form of a single man. On the 7th of December 1984, Warren Anderson, the chairman and CEO of Union Carbide, arrived in Bhopal. He intended to inspect the site and offer assistance. But the moment his plane touched the tarmac, the atmosphere shifted. In a move that shocked the international business community, Anderson was arrested by local authorities and charged with culpable homicide, not amounting to murder. His detention lasted only a few hours. Following high-level diplomatic communications between Washington and New Delhi, Anderson was released on bail and flown out of the city on a government-owned aircraft. He would never return to India to face trial. This moment became a permanent scar on the history of the disaster, a symbol of what many saw as a double standard in the value of human life. The question of whether his release was a diplomatic necessity or a subversion of justice remains a subject of intense debate among historians today. But while the executives and politicians negotiated, the city of Bhopal was left to deal with the physical reality of the ghost. The gas had not only killed, it had fundamentally altered the biology of the survivors. In the months that followed, the early signs of recovery failed to materialize. Instead, a new set of symptoms emerged. People who had survived the initial night began to suffer from a range of chronic conditions: breathlessness, extreme fatigue, and a loss of immune function that some doctors compared to a chemical form of AIDS. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. It wasn't just the people who were poisoned, it was the very ground they stood on. As researchers began to look closer at the factory site, they realized that the 1,984 leak might have been the most visible disaster, but it wasn't the only one. Archival documents from the years preceding the leak suggest that the factory had been leaking toxic waste into the local groundwater for a long time. Solar evaporation ponds, designed to hold liquid waste, had been leaking since at least 1982. The residents of the neighborhoods surrounding the plant, who relied on hand pumps for their daily water, had been drinking a cocktail of heavy metals and organochlorines for years. This layered history of contamination means that the 500,000 people poisoned by the gas were, in many cases, already victims of a slower, more silent environmental catastrophe. This revelation complicated the legal battle for compensation. How could one distinguish the damage caused by the midnight gas cloud from the damage caused by years of drinking contaminated water? As the 1980s drew to a close, the focus of the world's media began to drift away from Bhopal. But for the survivors, the escalation of their problems was just beginning. The initial death toll of 3,800, as reported by the government, was increasingly scrutinized. Non-governmental organizations and victim advocacy groups began a door-to-door census, revealing a much darker reality. They found that thousands of people had died in the weeks and months after the leak from secondary complications, deaths that were never officially recorded as being caused by the disaster. And that's when things began to shift toward a final, controversial settlement. In 1989, in a surprise move, the Indian Supreme Court mediated a settlement between Union Carbide and the Indian government. The company agreed to pay $470 million in a full and final settlement of all claims. To the survivors, the number was incomprehensible. When divided among the hundreds of thousands of claimants, the average payout was roughly $500 per person, barely enough to cover a few years of medical bills. The settlement also granted immunity from further criminal prosecution to the company and its officials. The slow burn of the disaster had reached a turning point. The legal case was closed, but the scientific and human reality was far from over. The plant itself was abandoned. It was left exactly as it was on the morning of the disaster. The skeletal remains of the MIC unit, the rusted pipes, and the piles of discarded chemicals remained in the heart of the city, surrounded only by a thin wire fence. But the disappearance of the legal responsibility did not mean the disappearance of the threat. In the late 1990s, a new generation of investigators entered the site. What they found inside the decaying warehouses suggested that the narrative of a single, accidental leak was only part of the story. They found thousands of tons of hazardous waste still sitting in open sheds, exposed to the elements. Every time it rained, the chemicals were washed deeper into the soil, moving toward the city's aquifers. But even as this new evidence surfaced, a new question arose. Who was now responsible for cleaning it up? Union Carbide had been purchased by Dow Chemical in 2001, and the new owners maintained that they had no liability for a site they had never operated, a site whose legal issues had been settled years before the merger. This gap in accountability created a stalemate that persists to this day. As the city grew, the neighborhoods around the factory expanded. New families moved into the shadow of the rusted towers, unaware that the ground beneath them was still a reservoir of industrial poisons. The story of Bhopal was no longer just about a night in 1984. It was becoming a story of a perpetual, modern-day crisis. The passage of time usually acts as a sedative for historical trauma. But in Bhopal, the calendar seems to have stalled. As the years turned into decades, a new and unsettling chapter began to emerge. The story of the children. By the mid-1990s, pediatricians in the areas surrounding the factory noticed a statistical anomaly that could no longer be ignored. Children born years after the gas had cleared were presenting with a staggering array of congenital disabilities, growth hormonal imbalances, and rare cancers. While some scientists argue that these issues are the result of the extreme poverty and malnutrition prevalent in the slums, others point to the mutagenic potential of methyl isocyanate. There is no clear consensus among the global scientific community on whether the gas leak altered the genetic map of a generation. However, the anecdotal evidence found in the wards of the Sambhavna Trust, a clinic dedicated to treating gas victims, paints a haunting picture. Here, the disaster is not a past event. It is a living, breathing inheritance. But the scars weren't just on the skin or in the DNA of the survivors. A psychological fog had settled over the city. Survivors spoke of a loss of spirit, a collective depression that followed the realization that their lives had been appraised and settled for a few $100s. This invisible injury remains one of the least documented aspects of the tragedy. Records suggest that the rates of post-traumatic stress in the Old City remained at epidemic levels long after the physical wounds had scarred over. And that's when a second, slower disaster began to reveal its true face. While the world remembered the gas cloud of 1984, the people of Bhopal were waking up to the reality of their water. In the early 2000s, independent laboratory tests of the groundwater in neighborhoods like Atal Ayub Nagar revealed concentrations of carbon tetrachloride and chloroform that were hundreds of times higher than safety limits. What they discovered in the breast milk of nursing mothers in these areas was perhaps the most chilling evidence of all. High levels of volatile organochlorines were being passed from mother to child, a toxic legacy fueled by the thousands of tons of chemical waste still sitting, uncontained, inside the abandoned factory walls. The ghost of the plant was no longer just in the air. It was in the very lifeblood of the community. The factory itself has become a sort of modern ruin, a skeletal monument to industrial overreach. Today, if you were to walk past the rusted gates, you would see a landscape reclaimed by nature. Tall grass grows through the cracks in the concrete where Tank 610 once sat. Monkeys climb the lattice of the vent gas scrubber. To a casual observer, it looks like a place where the story has ended. But for those who live just feet away, the ruins are a source of constant, low-level anxiety. Every monsoon season, the rain leaches more poisons from the soil into the wells. In 2014, Warren Anderson passed away in a nursing home in Florida at the age of 92. He died without ever having faced an Indian courtroom, and his death marked the end of any hope for a total legal resolution. For many in Bhopal, his quiet passing in the comfort of the United States was the final insult, a reminder of the vast distance between corporate responsibility and human consequence. But the death of the man did not mean the death of the movement. A new generation of activists, many of whom were infants on the night of the leak, has taken up the mantle. They are no longer just asking for compensation. They are asking for the right to know. They want the full release of the medical research conducted by the Indian Council of Medical Research in the 1980s data that was reportedly classified for years, leaving survivors in the dark about the long-term effects of the chemicals they had inhaled. There is no clear consensus on why this data was withheld. Some believe it was to prevent further legal liabilities for the government, while others suggest the findings were simply too inconclusive to be of use. What remains is a vacuum of information that has been filled by fear and speculation. The story of Bhopal is often compared to Chernobyl, but the comparison only goes so far. Chernobyl was a state-run disaster in a closed society. Bhopal was a corporate disaster in a burgeoning democracy. It raised questions that the world is still struggling to answer. What is the price of an anonymous life in a globalized economy? Does a corporation's identity and its liabilities change when it is bought and sold? As we look back from the perspective of the 21st century, the actual chemical cause of the disaster, whether it was a disgruntled employee with a hose or a series of cost-cutting measures that bypassed safety valves, almost feels secondary to the systemic failure that followed. The real tragedy of Bhopal may not have been the leak itself, but the 50 years of silence, litigation, and environmental neglect that came after the wind stopped blowing. Today, the city of Bhopal is vibrant and growing, It is a city of lakes, of bustling markets, and of high-tech ambitions. But the shadow of the Union Carbide plant remains a permanent fixture of its skyline. The site is a restricted zone, yet its influence is unrestricted. It is a place where the air is clear, but the ground is heavy with the weight of what happened. Some historians believe that Bhopal served as a grim wake-up call that led to the creation of modern industrial safety standards and the Responsible Care Initiative. They argue that the tragedy forced the global chemical industry to rethink its relationship with the communities it inhabits. Yet, others point to the fact that industrial accidents continue to occur in developing nations with alarming frequency, suggesting that the lessons of 1984 were only partially learned. What happened next remains unclear. There are ongoing proposals to turn the factory site into a memorial, a park, or a museum. But each proposal is met with a fundamental problem. The land is still toxic. To build a memorial, one must first clean the earth. And to clean the earth, one must first decide who will pay for it. As the sun sets over the rusted towers of the MIC plant, the silence is profound. It is the silence of a story that has no ending. Only a series of unanswered questions. The gauges in the control room are gone, the pipes have been stripped by scavengers, and the names of the dead are etched on fading memorials. But in the quiet neighborhoods nearby, a mother still draws water from a well, and a child still asks why their breath is short. The Bhopal gas leak was not a single moment in 1984. It is a continuous event, a slow-motion catastrophe that bridges the gap between the 20th and 21st centuries. It remains a stark reminder that in the pursuit of progress, the most dangerous leak of all is the leak of accountability. The record remains open, the soil remains tainted, and the city continues to wait for a resolution that may never come.